It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Fraser Hunter. He's the Principal Curator in Iron Age and Roman Collections at the National Museum of Scotland. His undergraduate degree and PhD were both from the University of Bradford, and he has worked at the National Museum since 1991. His research work focuses around understanding Iron Age decorative metalwork and making the most of Iron Age material culture, and understanding the impact of the Roman world on peoples of Scotland in its empire-wide context. Fraser has led a series of excavations, notably on the major hill fort at Traprain with colleagues from Bradford University and CFA Archaeology, and on the Iron Age settlements at Burney and Clarkley Hill, Moray.
Well, thank you, President. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for turning out. It is an honour to speak to the Society, and especially when I realise the significance of this evening in the Society's history. This is a fabulous room to talk in, I must say. So it's nice to get the chance to do that. What I would like to speak on this evening is one of the great finds of the Roman North. This marvellous hoard of late Roman hack silver from Traprain in southeast Scotland, a mere hour and a half's hop up the East Coast main line for you. And in fact, on the way up to Edinburgh, if you glance to your left, you will see the great hill of Traprain dominating the landscape. Well, we've just last year come to the end of a long-running project looking at this treasure. And what I would like to do this evening is tell you some of the fruits of that and also some of the speculations arising from it. I spoke at the University in Newcastle earlier in the year where they got the tedious detail. This evening you get the arm-waving speculation instead. It's not recorded, this, is it? So, Traprain, as I say, when you zoom up the railway up to Edinburgh, glance to your left and you will see this hill dominating the landscape. Traprain is like a humpback whale rising out of the fertile East Lothian plain. It's a hill with a history that goes back to the first hunter-gatherers moving through the landscape, and it's a place whose function changed over the millennia. A place of gathering and ceremony in the Neolithic, a place of burial in the earlier Bronze Age. But in the later Bronze Age, the hill was marked out with ramparts and it became a major power centre. During the Iron Age, the classic time of hill forts, it seemed the Traprain's history dropped off. It was a place to gather rather than a place to live. But in the Roman period, the core of our story, it became once again the heart of politics in this area. And it lies at the heart of our story thanks to the work of this gentleman here, who you see later in life, A.O. Currell, Alexander Currell. In many ways, the first professional archaeologist in Scotland. He was variously the first secretary of the Royal Commission. He was director of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, which is the great red sandstone building on Queen Street in Edinburgh, and then the Royal Museum, where the museum is today. Currell was many things, but one of those things was an active field worker. He really enjoyed life in the field. And from 1914 to 1923, with a break for the First World War, he led excavations, along with James Cree, of this great hill fort on Traprain, digging with 3 workmen for large chunks of each summer. The first 2 or 3 years produced interesting results, enough for the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland to continue supporting the work, but it was 1919 that really produced the bonanza. The first year they restarted after the Great War, and indeed the foreman George Pringle had fought in that war and returned to East Lothian to pick up his pick and shovel once again. And it was his pick that first revealed the Traprain treasure. Currell's diary records how Pringle was gently picking an area. You think, gently picking an area? How exactly do you do that? When the first piece of silver came up on the end of the pick. That doesn't happen today. It's JCBs instead today. Now, Currell was a busy museum man. He was at the time running both museums simultaneously because they were between directors. So he wasn't on site every day. He'd visit once or twice a week. So when the workmen discovered the treasure, they sent the youngest, Johnny, down the hill to East Linton to the nearest telephone to call Curl. But he was so guarded in using the public telephone that Curl didn't realise quite how urgent the matter was. So he didn't come out till the next day. He lunched in Edinburgh, took the train to East Linton, sauntered up the hill, and his diary says, "Imagine my surprise on reaching the edge of the excavation to see the silver arranged against the bank." Carol had his camera with him, and these are photographs he took on that day, which we've been able to get thanks to the generosity of the family. Here you see on the left Pringle with Johnny, the younger workman, and Young. And then the objects arranged, I think not quite as they were found, arranged photographically rather than archaeologically for Curl to record. 12th of May 1919. The discovery is one that can only be expressed in superlatives. It is the biggest, the best, the most dramatic hoard of hack silver anywhere. I'm glad you sucked in breath at that point, because when we did this photograph, the first time it had been photographed together for over 100 years, I hadn't quite realized how spectacular it looks. It is amazing. 23 kilograms of silver. Within 4 years, Curl had it published. Not a speed most archaeologists can match today, myself included, and the work has stood the test of time. It remains a fabulous record of the material. So why did we go back to this treasure? Well, times change. New discoveries are made, and there's been a wealth of late Roman silver coming out of the ground in the intervening century, and also new ways of approaching this material, new perspectives, as we'll see later on. But whereas Curl did this effectively single-handed, we pulled together an international team. Working particularly with the late Kenneth Painter of the British Museum and Anne-Marie Kaufmann-Heinemann from Basel University, with colleagues elsewhere from Basel, from Munich, from Bern, from Paris, from Cardiff, from much of Western Europe. And here you see the team assembled on the find spot, waiting for traditional East Lothian weather to sneak up behind them. What did we try to do? Well, one of the things we were trying to do was to look at the entire life cycle of the treasure. Curl's focus was very much on the silver as vessels, how they had once looked. We wanted to take the story from start to finish. From the making of these vessels, their use as vessels, their hacking and use as what we call hack silver, their burial, and then their discovery and afterlife. And while I will touch on all these aspects this evening, I'll focus mostly on the use as vessels and the use as hack silver. We'll look a little bit at production. Because knowledge of Roman silver and the habits of Roman silver makers have changed enormously since Curl's day. Curl was fortunate to have Brooke and Son silversmiths in Edinburgh advising him on the work, and we'll see more of their work later on. So he had the skills of practicing silversmiths to advise him. But there are techniques we can use today he simply didn't have available. Things like X-rays. Now, when you X-ray silver, one of the things you see is the variation in metal thickness. This is the very bowl that George Pringle removed on his pick. You can see the hole in the side where the pick went. But the reason I show you this image is for two things. One is you can see that the beads around the edge are hollow. They've been punched up from behind using a punch and die. But you will also see that there are lines, circumferential lines, curving their way around. And this is from the finishing of the object on a lathe, the hammering and finishing on a lathe. And the variation of the thickness of the metal is reflected in the varying X-ray density. So we were able to get a lot of information with my colleague Lord Troylan and Janet Lang to extract a lot of information on how these objects were made. But one of the questions is, where were they made? And this has long been a point of discussion. For many years, it was assumed these things had to be Mediterranean products. And in fact, Curl, in his diary, from the very first entries in his diary, he sees these objects as coming from the Mediterranean or from the east, from Alexandria or somewhere like that. And there have long been attempts based on art historical analysis to try to understand where these objects were made. The problem is, styles were exchanged widely in the late Roman world. I could take an example of one of those bowls, for instance, and I could find you parallels in Germany, in Italy, and in Syria, which you could swap into Traprain without even noticing. So style is not a reliable guide. And we have begun to try to use science. Silver is very rarely a native metal. Silver is normally extracted from lead. So you smelt the lead and then you extract silver from that by process of cupellation. This leaves traces of the lead lurking in the silver. And you can look at different isotopes of lead that pinpoint its geological age, and different outcrops of lead or different seams of lead have different geological ages. So in principle, you can say where silver comes from. We were a little wary over this because the risk is recycling can mess these things up. We also didn't, because it was quite experimental, we didn't have all the funding to deal with this. So initially, what we looked at was not the silver, but the solder. A number of the vessels used effectively glue to stick them together. On the rear of this handle fitting, you will see the grey gunk, which is a lead tin alloy. And whereas silver does get recycled, solder doesn't. So solder is a really reliable clue where things come from. And Roland Schwab in Mannheim analysed the samples we had. And what they showed us was patterns like this. They showed us they didn't come from the normal Mediterranean sources. This is Greek sources, Spanish sources here, more Spanish and Italian sources here. The best fits for our samples are either the North Pennines or the Western Rhineland. Now, this is the solder, not the silver. But if the objects are being stuck together in the Northwest provinces, there's a good chance that some of them at least are being made in the Northwest provinces. So we don't need to turn to the Mediterranean for this glamorous silver. Some at least could be being made much more locally, perhaps in Britain itself. So having published this big chunky volume, a volume which one reviewer said, don't read in bed, it might kill you if it falls on you, we need to do more work to understand it. So we're hoping to raise some more money to now analyse the silver itself and see if that too supports this story. So we've made progress with the question of production. How about use, the use of the vessels themselves? Silver was late Roman elite dining material. This was the stuff you showed off with on the dinner table. And this wonderful mosaic from the Villa Cadedi in Sicily gives you an idea of how the silver is being used. We see what's probably a hunting party reclining for their lunch, and we see wine and water being poured from silver jugs into a glass container. We see more wine and water being stored here. Hands being washed with water being poured into a beaded rim bowl. And then some poor chicken or something similar on a large platter in the center of the table. And again, look at the beads. We've seen these distinctive beads on the X-ray earlier on. Well, we have fragments of all this material within the Traprain treasure. The wine flagons, the platters, the basins for washing the hands. This was very much how the late Roman elite showed off. If you went for dinner with somebody, you would expect to be served in silver. One of the striking things we've been able to do is look at new finds of silver at parallels Curl could never have known. One of the most intriguing objects was this fragment of a dish with a fish identified by zoologists at the time as most likely a red mullet. There were no parallels known in the 1920s, but Currell speculated it could be a heart-shaped vessel, and how right he was. Because discoveries some 15 years ago of a hoard at Vinkovci in Croatia produced exactly such a vessel, heart-shaped, with a dolphin handle for lifting it, and when this was conserved, a fish was also engraved on this. This is for serving fish fillets at the table. You would open your fish out and serve it on a platter like this. And in the case of the Vinkovci one, there are little perforations for the steam or the juices to pass through. And again, it reminds us of the degree of individuality in Roman cuisine. There's real specialist silverware here. It's much like you would have seen in the 19th century in a dinner service, with separate knives for fish or for steak and so on, separate platters for lots of different purposes. This was very much display dining going on. Dining and drinking, for of course no good meal without wine. And the Romans would be drinking their wine diluted, as we saw, with both wine and water. One of the finest and apparently intact vessels from the hoard, although we'll see more about that later on, is this glorious wine flagon, some 8 inches high, which depicts the earliest Christian scenes we have surviving in Scotland, some of the earliest from North Britain. These have excited enormous controversy over the years. The late Joseph Engelmann was able to extract further details from them. Thanks to the miracles of modern technology, we can unroll the decoration, and you can see it much more clearly here. There are 2 different friezes. The one on the lower frieze, the larger frieze, contains 4 scenes from the Old and the New Testament. From the Old Testament, you have Adam and Eve and the snake making improper suggestions, and you have Moses striking the rock to bring forth water for the Israelites. On the right, the Virgin and the Christ child receiving the 3 wise men. And then this scene that has long puzzled scholars because of the damage done when the handle was removed from the vessel. It's been argued to be the betrayal of Christ. It's been argued to be the miracle of the quails in the desert, although as one commentator acidly commented, the total absence of quails in the scene and suggests it's not much of a miracle. But Engelmann argued very plausibly, what you're actually seeing is the ascension, a scene of the ascension, and the figure in the center is the angel pointing to the spot where Christ will return to. So you're seeing, if you like, the beginning and the end aspects of Christ's life. And very seasonally appropriate as we approach Advent, one of the things that Engelmann also commented on is how the upper and the lower friezes link together in a story. The upper frieze had long been thought just to be a standard Roman scene of the good life, you know, the casual, relaxed world of the countryside. But in fact, this is most likely the shepherds watching their flocks at night above Bethlehem. The manger where Christ was born, and the star leading the wise men from the east. So we see an articulated story, different bits of the Christian story brought together in this one vessel. And it shows the value of going back to these apparently well-known objects with fresh eyes. Now, Currell suggested this might even be a Christian hoard or elements taken from a church. But in fact, there's a real mixture of material in this hoard. Some of it tells us about early Christian beliefs. Other aspects take us straight to the pages of Roman mythology, figures who we learnt about even today as children. And again, let us unroll this wine flagon, and we can see a satyr pursuing a dancing nymph on the left, an altar with an acanthus bush, and the figure on the right is most likely Bacchus, the god of wine, discovering Ariadne. And Bacchus, of course, as the god of wine, is a very appropriate figure to have on a wine flagon. A mix in that sense of both pagan and Christian ideas, which is very, very current in the 4th century, the 4th and 5th century, the date of this hoard, because this seems to be the time when these matters are being heavily discussed. So feasting is a big part of it. The bulk of the silver in the hoard is connected effectively with partying. But the other big chunk is to do with elite female identity. If you're a powerful woman, a matrona in a household, one of the ways you mark that is by the use of silver in your daily regime. And this wonderful mosaic from Sidi Grib in Tunisia gives you a sense of that. We see the woman of the house sitting with her servants, looking at her reflection in a silver mirror. There are what would originally have been cosmetics being brought in a silver bowl. Some of her clothing is kept in a silver container here. We have a silver wash basin and a bucket probably for water here. Here is the jug and another perfume container here. Silver was a key part of female identity at this time, and we find aspects of this as well in the hoard. This wonderful wash basin, intact except folded in half when it was found and opened out in the restoration work. And this again takes us straight to the pages of classical mythology with a nereid, a sea nymph riding a sea panther, beautifully depicted with her jewellery, her body chain and her armlets. And you'll see also the fish of the sea popping out from round about. And we also have remains of some of the cosmetic containers that would have held the perfumes and the ointments that would have been a key part of her regime. These surviving as fragments, but again, we can turn to parallels elsewhere in silver in the Esquiline treasure from Rome, or in ivory in this set from Aquincum, to show you how powerful women would have used these to express not their status, not just from the objects they were applying, the sediment, the salves they were applying, but from the very material itself, the silver and the ivory. There is a small amount of personal equipment, and most of it is military. The belt fittings tie in to soldiers' equipment from the late Empire, but not from one person's set. There is a whole jumble of material brought together from different sources, and we also have a lurking brooch and a pin, most likely from female ornament, and a strap that may well come from horse gear. And there was a handful of coins. Now for Curl, the coins were critical for the dating, coins ending in Arcadius and Honorius. But these were not the way coins should look. Late Roman siliquae, which is what these are, should look something like this. And what happens in Britain particularly is they are selectively nibbled away at until only the face of the emperor is left intact. If you want to cause an argument among coin specialists, lob a clipped silica among them and watch them squabble for the next 10 years or so. There's been huge amounts of debate over what these things were for, because normally clipping is fraudulent. It was the kind of thing in the medieval period would get you sent to the tower. But there's a plausible argument that what we're seeing here is something different. Honorius, whose face you see on these coins, was the last Roman emperor to rule over Britain. These coins were kept in circulation after coinage ceased to flow, after Britain was part of the Roman Empire. And there is a plausible argument that what people are doing is clipping away bits of silver to reuse it as payment, particularly for military pay, and yet the coins retain a face value, literally a face value, so they still exist as some form of circulating coinage. And this is mostly a habit of the civilian zone, of the south and the east. You rarely see these coins in the north. It suggests the authorities in the south and the east, as the empire creaks and abandons them, are trying to keep some kind of economy running. And this clipping This variation, this modification of silver takes us away from complete objects and into the fragments. For this was a hoard of pieces, not of wholes. The images you have seen look great because of the restoration work done to them. These wonderful objects went into the ground in fragments. Alexander Curl could not conceive of this. How could anybody hack up wonderful classical silver? And as a classically educated Edwardian gentleman, of course he would think that. The idea that this would be chopped to bits had to be the work of barbarians. In his very earliest references in his diary, he speaks of pirates' loot. Where was this treasure plundered from, he says. And there was this long tradition of viewing the Traprain treasure as being the work of the barbarians, erupting into the Roman Empire as it began to creak and crumble. Well, Kenneth Painter and I had some concerns over this interpretation, not least because of the distribution of such hoards. They are found on both sides of the frontier. The black line is the late Roman frontier. And hack silver is just as common inside as outside the empire. And as you look at it more carefully, as you look at the early stages of this, it's being done very carefully. If this is the work of barbarians, they are obsessive compulsive barbarians. For they are chopping things carefully into halves and then quarters, as you can see in the Traprain vessel, or in the case of the one from Grossbodogan, cut into sixths, and then the sixths themselves carefully subdivided. Why would you do that? Well, Roman vessels are often made to set weights. A pound of silver or 2 pounds of silver. The bowls to your left probably weighed originally 1 pound. You chop it into 4, you have 4 handy £1/4 lumps of silver in your pocket. And what you're seeing is the shift from presentation silver to bullion. At times of trouble and at times of crisis, what you want is portable wealth. And from the 3rd and 4th centuries onwards, as various troubles hit the Roman world, portable wealth is what the elite are needing. This question of weight became something of an obsession during the project. I would weigh anything that didn't move. And you see again and again recurring patterns. So on the bottom from Water Newton in Suffolk, yes, or Cambridgeshire, somewhere down south, you see 2 lumps of silver, one of them weighing 1 pound, one of them weighing 2 pounds. Or on the top, a hoard from Echt in Limburg in the Netherlands, the combined weight of that silver is £0.5 pound. And if you're obsessive, as I was for this, you work through every single hoard and you get wonderful diagrams like this. Don't worry, you don't need to read the detail, just admire how much green there is on it. Green is good. Green means there is a weight correlation, either in individual objects or in convincing packages or in the whole thing. Red is bad. And you will see there is far more good than bad, and I can explain away all the bad stuff with almost no sleights of hand. So for me, it showed quite convincingly the purpose of hacking is bullion. This is, at first, an economic process, creating portable wealth. And this is happening in particular at times of economic trouble. Now, those could be personal economic trouble, or they could be much larger scale things. And if you look at where and when they occur, we start to see patterns. So in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, particularly the 3rd century, most hack silver comes from Gaul and Germany. An area that starts to see erupt, there's a separatist movement, the Gallic Empire, you see various barbarian invasions. The 3rd century is not a good time to be in Gaul and Germany. And so the beginnings of this habit here make perfect sense. The bulk of hack silver, though, dates to the 4th and 5th centuries and is in the northwestern provinces, the time when the Western Empire, when the northern frontier is crumbling, the time when there is all manner of turmoil and political change. So again, we can understand why turning your big dishes into portable wealth makes an awful lot of sense. And the habit continues into the 6th and 7th centuries, particularly in Denmark. We won't touch much on that this evening, but there is this continuing use of silver in this form right into the 6th century in Denmark. This gives us a sense of how the phenomenon varies over time and space, but archaeologists love to classify. There is nothing better than a typology, and all good typologies fall into 3 parts, much like Gaul. So here we have the typology of hack silver. Category A, which we'll only touch on briefly, is effectively Roman silver hoards of coin or of vessels with a little bit of hack silver. And the example I show you there from Xanten is mostly a coin and spoon hoard with one hacked element in there. Category B are ones where hack silver is dominant, Roman hack silver is dominant, and category C are where we see local hack silver being used with a little bit of Roman. And we'll focus mostly on B and touch at the end on C. For A is effectively this economic phenomenon that I mentioned. This is the hacking of objects inside the empire at times of economic need. The tax collector's coming, the barbarians are at the gates. I must chop my plate into bits and either hide it or take it away. But the interesting point is this next phase, when silver, this group B hoard dominated by hack silver, where silver hops across the frontier for the first time. Why is that happening? Well, we could blame the barbarians. But unlike Curl, I wouldn't see this as loot. I think there's very little evidence of loot being the argument behind this, because we don't see the irregular chopping one might expect. The care of the chopping suggests one process is payoff or subsidy, frontier politics, offerings being given to groups beyond the frontier to keep them friendly. But this is only part of the story, because hack silver occurs on both sides of the frontier. And here we turn to another key aspect, which is, how do you pay your soldiers? Soldiers are paid in silver and in gold. And on the right, we see an image of late Roman soldiers. And on the left, an image from a document called the Notitia Dignitatum, where we're seeing the page advertising the man who does the payments, the Count of the Sacred Largesse. And on the accession of a new emperor, and every 5 and 10 years after that, the soldiers would receive effectively a bonus payment. 5 gold coins and a pound of silver. You see this gathered up here. And the silver could come in many different forms. Could come in vessels, could come in belt buckles, could come in all manner of different things. It could come in hack silver. And in particular, it could come in hack silver if you're somebody who wants to pay off the troops, but you don't happen to control the treasury. If you are, for example, a usurper, somebody who wants to claim the purple. The late Roman world is full of generals who want to be emperors, and one of their big problems is paying soldiers. Here we see the great hoard from Kaiseraugst in Switzerland, which in many ways is a much more typical hoard, full of these wonderful, boring intact vessels. That intact stuff is where the story is at. But appropriately, right in the center of the picture, star of the show, is a tiny piece of hack silver and a hacked ingot. And these relate the hoard to a soldier serving for Magnentius, who was a usurper, who was raised up in the 350s, came out of Britain, eventually came to a nasty end. Because usurpers can't pay the troops, they don't have access to the mint to make coins, they don't have access to skilled metalsmiths to make vessels, they take silver in any form they can. They take it as tax, they take it as plunder, they chop it up, and they either give you it as lumps of silver or form it into ingots. Britain had a conveyor belt of usurpers in the course of the 4th and early 5th century, and many of them turned to hack silver to pay the troops. And this gentleman here, Constantine III, who pulls the field army out of Britain, most likely in 409. So if you want a Roman who abandons Britain, it's this gentleman here. He pays his soldiers in hack silver. Many of the hoards we have with hack silver in them end in coins of Constantine. Because once he moves onto the continent and starts striking coinage, he uses coins and silver to pay the soldiers off. So a lot of these hoards, all the red dots here, plausibly tie into usurpers. So hacking things up is in big part, a way of paying soldiers. But of course, there's no single explanation. It's not just that. There are also subsidies to barbarians. There are also individual economic problems. All these things tied together. This gives us the context to turn once more to Traprain. What is happening on Traprain in the Roman period? Well, it's long been noticed that Traprain sits in an area of Scotland where there are no known Roman installations. East Lothian and Fife are areas where we don't know of military forts at this time. And both have been argued to be friendly kingdoms or client kings. And the evidence for Traprain is strong. There is a wealth of Roman finds off the site. More Roman finds from Traprain than the rest of Iron Age Scotland put together, including evidence of people learning Latin. The earliest schoolroom exercise in North Britain you see here. So these are people who built links with the Roman world over generations. And when the Romans finally fell back to Hadrian's Wall in the early 3rd century, they kept links with their friends in the north. Over most of the Roman period, Traprain hadn't been fortified. The ramparts around the hill were effectively ancient monuments dating back to centuries before. But sometime in the 5th century, a massive defensive wall was built around the site. You still stumble over the remains when you walk up the main pathway today. And excavations by myself, Ian Armitt and Andy Dunwell inside the site have shown wherever there isn't bare rock, there is archaeology at this period. It is incredibly densely settled. A real focal point, a power centre for the local area, and a place rich in Roman finds. High quality glassware that the late Jennifer Price argued could have been a diplomatic gift. And the kind of bronze fittings that mark out soldiers, people who have served for Rome, are marked by these belt buckles and crossbow brooch. So we know there are folks serving the Roman world here. The idea of silver coming north for service is plausible. All the more so when we start to disentangle the hoard. These two fragments here, for example, from the same vessel, together weigh exactly 8 Roman ounces. This is not an accident. And we can begin to look for patterns in the weights of the hoard. The diagram here is what's called a rank-sized plot, from the lightest weight things on the left to the heaviest things on the right. So this is mass going up this way. And what we are seeing, what we're looking for are steps. Steps mark preferred weights. And often these steps do indeed correlate with Roman weight units. But the skeptic will quickly object. There are also an awful lot of things that don't correlate with Roman weight units. That's because the Traprain treasure lives additional lives. This silver is not just hacked once. If you look at a fragment like this, different tools were used to cut different edges. Shears, most likely on this edge, a chisel along here, this apparently chewed by a rabid dog. This is not the same tools, therefore most likely not the same person, not the same place, not the same time. Some of this treasure is hacked and hacked and hacked again. Here, for example, a dish that was cut in half and then cut in a quarter, and the quarter was cut down further, and the plain silver was cut away, and then this final fragment was cut, and yet it wasn't cut. It was beaten with a hammer and folded to break it, suggesting you've moved away from a world of skilled metalsmiths and with people who are simply wanting to get the most out of their silver. So the Traprain treasure does not come to the site in one go. Some pieces probably do come straight from the Roman world, like the intact dish. Some have lived interesting lives before they got to the site. And we can see that also in the production dates of the material. Stephanie Martin-Kilshire pointed out the earliest finds date to around 300, the latest to around 450. This hoard comes to the site in pieces. It comes in different bits. Now, I am a self-confessed hack silver obsessive, but even I have to admit, hack silver is not the only story in town. When we plot the dots on the map, there are big gaps in lots of areas. Silver moved in many different forms at this time. In the late Roman period, you could get your silver in lots of different ways. In vessels, in coinage, in ingots, or in hack silver. And they all tell us different stories. Vessels are almost all inside the empire. This is what we saw on the dinner table of the people in Sicily earlier on. These are your mobile international elites moving around across the Roman world, estates in many different provinces using this material within the empire. It very rarely moves beyond. There is a cluster in the Eastern Empire of diplomatic gifts. Within Britain, as you'll see from the dots, most of the finds are in the south, but I can't resist for a Newcastle audience showing some of the Northern English finds. Finds from the 1990s of a pair of spoons from Spennymoor near Barnard Castle. The Corbridge Lanks, now in the British Museum, it found eroding out of the river to the east of Corbridge, along with a range of other silverware, sadly now lost. And this lost spoon found somewhere near Sunderland. Originally, it would have looked very similar to this one here. That curl there is part of the fixing of the fitting there. So there is also silver around in the north, although little of it has survived for us to see today. So silver is marking out the elites of the late Roman world. Ingots cling to the frontiers. Ingots are ways you pay soldiers in lumps of silver on the Balkans, on the Rhine frontier, and particularly on the Saxon shore within Britain, fighting off the emerging pirate problem. Coins are really odd. The individual coins circulate widely, but the hoards cluster in Britain and cluster in Romania. These ones are linked to payoffs to the Goths in the 360s. These ones we'll come back to in a minute. There is something odd about Britain. So we're seeing different silver moving in different ways with the elites, with the frontier army moving in exchange. And hack silver in a way confuses these pictures, blurring it across the frontiers. It's because it's a secondary use, the material being chopped and recycled and reused. But what interests me for the moment is the big gaps, the areas beyond the frontier, in Barbaricum so-called, where there's no silver. Why is that? Silver is not the only way you pay soldiers. Most soldiers, most barbarians get paid in gold. And if we turned to the Rhine or we turned to Hungary, Roman gold is the material that is flowing north of the frontier. And yet, in most of Britain and Ireland, we don't see the gold in hack silver hoards. And my continental colleagues are extremely sniffy about the calibre of our barbarians. Apparently, our barbarians weren't threatening enough. They didn't deserve gold, they only got silver. This is, of course, nonsense, because gold was coming north. There is a series of spectacular gold finds from north of Hadrian's Wall. The kind of things that mark out imperial gifts. Crossbow brooches, the signs of the late Roman army. This glorious crossbow brooch, which is an imperial gift from Diocletian himself. A medallion of Constantius Chlorus, again given to somebody as a token of loyalty. A golden arm ring made in a Roman workshop. These are the markers that you would give to powerful troops and pay off powerful enemies or powerful friends north of the frontier. But we see much less gold than silver. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's look first of all at the problem of Britain. This is a map of Richard Hobbs showing precious metal hoards in the period where Britain is disengaging with the Roman Empire, the Roman period equivalent of Brexit, if you like, when material coinage stops flowing into Britain. The imperial exchequer ceases after Constantine leaves Britain. And around this period, we see a huge quantity of silver and gold going into the ground in Britain. Now, we've seen already different kinds of material are coming in different ways. And too often people treat these objects separately. They think about the coins, or they think about the plate, or they think about the ingots. But we need to stop having a Roman view. We need to start thinking about these things the way people had to think about them in the 5th century. This is just silver. This is bullion. These three hoards look very different. The great Hoxton treasure from Suffolk on display in the British Museum looks like a big coin hoard, but the coins, the silver coins, weigh exactly 56 pounds. All the rest of the silver weighs exactly 18 pounds. This is bullion. This isn't valued as things to pay off with, or things to show off with, or things to dine with. This is bullion. The hoard from Ballin Rees in County Derry weighs exactly 26 pounds of silver. Again, it's bullion. And we've seen in the Traprain treasure again and again the weight correlations there coming north as bullion. All forms of silver can be used in this transformed economy. Beyond the edge of the Roman world is the weight of silver that matters now. Silver to be chopped up and melted down and turned into local prestige goods. Some of these are small things. Pins and rings that would catch the eye across a fire flickering house. Silver does gleam and catch your eye when you see it. And we see these across the length and breadth of Britain and Ireland at this time. But most dramatically, the great silver chains. Found only in Scotland, found only in southern Scotland and northeastern Scotland. This is conspicuous consumption of this late Roman silver. Melt your silver down and turn into these grand neck ornaments. They're often called Pictish chains because a couple of them have symbols on them, but they're not. They're a southern Scottish habit, some of which acquires Pictish symbols. The Picts are the groups up in the northeast here. Why do you make chains? Well, the chain is a version of a torque. The torque was the great Iron Age status symbol. Here you see the hoard from Blair Drummond in Stirlingshire. So it's a long-running habit that you're using silver for, taking Roman silver, turning it into a local habit. But this was also a late Roman habit. The army were rewarded with torques, and military decorations were given as torques. And in other areas beyond the edges of the empire, we find gold torques in Sweden in the Lower Rhine. And these ones here in particular have been argued very plausibly as the products of Roman workshops being given north as military gifts. Is that where our chain started life? As military rewards, as military decorations? But why silver? Why is there this preference for silver rather than gold? Well, we are conditioned to think of gold as being the most valuable metal imaginable. But that's not an absolute. It's what we choose to call it. Different metals have different values. There can be a symbolism. If you go to Central America, for example, gold is the metal of the sun, silver is the metal of the moon. There can be a whole symbolism around what you want. There can also be a tradition. In Northern Britain and in Ireland, gold is local. Silver is exotic. And also silver has the mark, the smell of Rome to it. So I think silver becomes more important than gold in these areas. And it also becomes a way of marking yourself out from your neighbours. These dodgy Anglo-Saxons coming in from the south who value gold over silver. So there can be a cultural choice in this material. Silver becomes the prestige good for the next several 100 years. This Roman silver lives on and on and on. We can take a hoard like Norreys Law in Fife, the Pictish silver hoard, which includes, lurking within it, fragments of Roman silver. The last residues of material that's been melted down and recycled again and again. And within this, where you're seeing silver being made into objects, the objects then being parceled up, melted down, made into more objects. They are conserving and reusing this precious metal, but we can see some of the real star items they are making from it. This silver pin, which actually again might even be a Roman product, is high quality Roman quality silver, and it weighs exactly 1 Roman ounce. This might be the kind of thing that a workshop in York is making to send north to these barbarian groups. And this tear-shaped plaque with classic Pictish symbols on it, whose function still puzzles us, though I do wonder if it might be an emblem from a helmet. Let's go back to Traprain and draw our story to a close. The hoard is buried for Currell's workmen to discover, and the reconstruction of the setting by the late Ian Smith shows that it's buried in the yard of a house. There's nothing to mark this house out as anything special. We can speculate all we like for the reasons for its burial, but it's hard to get beyond the idea that it's being placed there for safekeeping and never recovered. I want to finish with the afterlife. We've seen the fragments. And if you go to the museum, National Museum today in Chambers Street, you will see the glorious original. The shift from fragment to original was done thanks to these gentlemen here, Brooke and Son, goldsmiths to the king. They restored the treasure for Currell using techniques that it's fair to say would not be conservation approved today. We very rarely heat silver up red hot. We very rarely hammer it back into shape. We never put it in acid baths. But these silversmiths did all these things in order to reshape the silver. And when we look at the objects today, as I say, the flagon we saw earlier in the talk originally was crushed into 2 fragments. And the silversmiths restored it to form, causing a lot of damage to traces of technology in the process, but creating this dramatic display piece. And it's because Currell's interest was in the original objects. What I've tried to show you this evening is the joy of fragments. Brooke and Son smelled an opportunity. They started making replicas, paying 5% commission to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland for the benefit of being allowed to do this. And they made a wonderful range of things, which we see being made in their thousands in some years, particularly the little triangular bowls that were used as salt cellars or these kind of things. These bowls are very popular as trophies. You can still compete at Dunbar Golf Club for a Traprain Law bowl. They restored some of the fragments to give you a sense of their original form. So this piece here comes from what is probably a wedding present, a good 1.5 feet across. They packaged them up for contemporary taste. Salt cellars converted from flagons and little cruet sets like this. They modified it according to the needs of the 1920s. A pusher to feed a baby, literally born with a silver spoon in your mouth, or The spoons converted into ashtrays for balancing your cigarette or your cigar on. The dolphin ladle converted into a tea strainer. They really saw the commercial opportunities of these things, and they're still highly collectible items today. It's a lovely aftermath. It shows the impact this discovery had on the imagination of the time. I hope what I've been able to show you is the value of going back to old finds with new eyes. The value of revisiting these apparently well-known things with new perspectives and with a new range of techniques and a new range of specialists. In particular, showing you the changing role of silver, the ways that different kinds of silver are moving among different people, the vessels, the ingots, the coins, and the shift out of a Roman economic world into the world after, where silver is not stuff for the dinner table, it's stuff you wear to show off with. This isn't economics, this is prestige. And it becomes the key prestige resource for the early medieval kingdoms of northern Britain. I hope that's given you a taster of why the silver is so fascinating. If you want to know more, there are books on the topic. Thank you very much.